So it looks like Space Marines could be jumping from one of the weakest armies in the game to one of the strongest, and the ridiculously threatening firepower of the Iron Hands might be one of the most common ways that they're run going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Iron Hands, the Space Marine chapter that was absolutely stomping the tournaments towards the end of 8th edition, and it looks like there's a pretty reasonable chance they'll be doing so once more. In Warzone Nephilim, Iron Hands weren't doing too badly as far as Space Marine chapters went. They had the best win rate out of the more standard Codex chapters by far, around about a 45% win rate when most Space Marines were sub 40. Despite the nerfs that they had to them all the way since 8th edition, their Codex does remain a pretty powerful one, some really powerful shooting rules, and between their vehicles and heavy weapon synergies, it makes them one of the best chapters for about half the units in the Space Marine book. They were doing kind of okay before, held back by the raw power of Space Marines, but now they've got ridiculously better on two fronts, loads of free war gear handed out to Space Marine units, and particularly a lot of slightly weaker shooting stuff getting a lot better, but perhaps more importantly for the Iron Hands, whole game Devastator Doctrine, giving you 3 fairly spectacular buffs army-wide. Let's talk about that scary Devastator Doctrine, their chapter tactics, and their rather good support options, and finish up with a few of the most standout units for these Sons of Medusa. While we're on the subject of Iron Hands though, I thought I might just mention the Auspex Tactics giveaway for this month, which will be for 4 copies of the Iron Hands Battle Force, the one from the Space Marine Battle Force box sets that came out towards the start of this year. In it there's Iron Father Feirros, the unique special character of the Iron Hands, a Primaris Tech Marine, 10 Intercessors, 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, and some Iron Hands upgrade sprues. The Dreadnoughts and the Intercessors I think are generally just quite useful miniatures to have in Space Marines in general. The Tech Marines are good support for them, and bar Feirros himself you could easily use all the miniatures for most chapters. As per normal with these giveaways, there's 2 equal ways to enter, links down in the video description below. Support the channel on Patreon and help keep those videos coming that way, or support the channel via social media for free entry, and to do that you just need to subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, and then you actually enter the draw on the 1st of February. There's a Facebook post that appears on the channel's Facebook page. Reply to that photo with a picture of any 40k miniatures with your name handwritten within the photo, the last bit to ward off spammers, and then I put all the entries into the draw, Patreon and Facebook, and pick out the 4 winners with a random number generator. The links to both the Patreon and the Facebook page are down in the video description below. Feel free to give them a look if you're interested, there'll be further similar giveaways to this each and every month. Back to the subject in hand, and I thought we'd start by talking about perhaps the best thing out of the Iron Hands, which is their Devastator Doctrine Calculated Fury. This was perhaps the main reason that Games Workshop initially made that change to Space Marine combat doctrines, where they had to progress and cycle through them, as when you couldn't sit in Devastator Doctrine for this all game long, it was considered a bit too much. Now though, it's back with full effect. You get extra AP on all your heavy weapons all game long, and I believe that Iron Hands are pretty much going to be spamming them all the way. In particular, it can be quite helpful for lower AP things, say for example suppressor autocannons. The Iron Hands specific bits though are rerolling ones to hit with heavy weapons, that's army wide and it applies to non-core vehicles as well. Really quite nice as they're not the sort of unit that you can usually get that kind of buff on, and it's just nice reliable flat damage dealing all game long. Pretty nice if you also had any heavy weapon plasma cannons on the go, like the Redemptor's Macro Plasma. Finally, and also very helpfully, is that they don't suffer the penalty for moving and firing with heavy weapons, which basically makes any sort of infantry unit with a heavy weapon massively better as well. It means that you can move and fire with things like heavy eradicators, devastators, or eliminators, and be hitting just as well as if you were stationary, and even better than that with the reroll ones to hit on top of it. If you compare the rule to versions like the Ultramarines one, it's actually an even more powerful rule than that one, as the Ultramarines one gives them counters as stationary, which actually interacts with a core rulebook FAQ, meaning that you still don't get that if you arrive from reserve or something. It means that Iron Hands can still say drop in from a drop pod and still be firing to full effect, whereas the Ultramarines wouldn't, even if they were arriving from strategic reserve or something turn 2. This last bit is very nice for drop pod devastators in particular. Drop pod devastators are one of the easiest Iron Hands tactics that most lists seem to employ. They're perhaps one of the few chapters that very reliably does use drop pods, because as mentioned they can arrive turn 1 and then don't have to worry about the heavy weapons penalty and even get the boost to hit. A typical loadout might be something like a drop pod for 70 points, then 2 units of 5 devastators inside it, now just 115 points each, which is pretty crazy. That includes all their basic heavy weapons. If you want to build out to the multi-melters, that's 10 points extra each. If you just had Space Marines of a different chapter, then they'd be hitting on 4s with no rerolls. But if you're playing them with Iron Hands, then they'd be hitting on 3s and rerolling 1s to hit. For the majority of the squad that isn't affected by the Signum, that means that the Iron Hands Devastators will be hitting 77% of the time, compared with the 50% for the standard Space Marines. It's a really big difference, and it makes first turn strikes with Devastators a very scary prospect. You can focus some precision damage on the enemy unit that you think is most likely going to be the one that causes you problems later in the game. They're pretty well in auto-include territory, and perhaps the single best unit that makes most use of the Iron Hands Doctrine. I feel like the Doctrine is perhaps one of the single best selling points of Iron Hands, but they also get their regular chapter tactics as well, and Iron Hands lists have a bit of a choice here. Do you play for the regular chapter with the Flesh is Weak chapter tactic, or do you go for perhaps some more melee-orientated successors? The Flesh is Weak is their standard one, representing their bionics, a 6+ feel no pain army-wide. That usually equates to a 20% durability boost, though it can be a bit less than that on infantry targeted with really massive damage weapons, where if you're taking excess wounds, it makes it less likely that feel no pain is going to save you. On top of that, vehicles count as double wounds for the purposes of bracketing and things, which is helpful enough. Overall, it's a nice enough little durability boost, particularly to vehicles. In general, I'd rate this as okay and very usable. Durability certainly doesn't hurt. It really does seem though that Iron Hands perhaps play better without it and going for the successor chapters rather than that. Perhaps partly because you can still access a feel no pain when you desperately need it for 1 command point on infantry. Perhaps the most obvious and most played combo for successor chapter tactics would tend to be Master Artisans plus Whirlwind of Rage, and I think it is pretty easy to make the argument that this adds more to the chapter overall. Whirlwind of Rage is the good melee one. That one gives you exploding 6s to hit in the first round of combat. Usually that will mean something like a 25% increase to your melee damage, which is pretty decent, though it's actually even more than that on some units, say for example Thunderhammer and Stormshield Terminators that usually hit on 4s. Then combine that with Master Artisans, which just gives you an extra hit reroll every single time you have a unit that either shoots or fights. That one would certainly feel very nice when combined with all the rerolls from the Devastator Doctrine. It means that you get to reroll all your 1s innately, and then you also get to reroll a 2 as well. Quite nice that it amps up a bit of shooting and melee, even if it's only a small boost. Overall, I would rate that combo as stronger. It both improves shooting and melee very significantly. There are a few trade-offs to it though. The better relics are a bit more expensive as you have to pay an extra CP. It alters a couple of stratagems slightly, though I'd say it isn't the biggest deal in the world. And you also can't run Iron Father Feirros if you did desperately want to run him. In general though, by tournament data, it does seem that the latter has a lot more success than the generic chapter. Successors are probably the way to go for absolutely optimized lists. Then let's talk through some of the support options from the codex. The Iron Hands have a fair amount of decent relics, though all of these ones you would have to pay the extra command point for if you weren't playing standard Iron Hands, and it does make them a bit less good. Out of their relic section, I think my favourite 2 relics would probably be the Ironstone and the Tempered Helm. If you're standard Iron Hands, then both of those are pretty reasonable, I think. The Ironstone is the one that allows you to give a boost to a vehicle within 3 inches and make any attacks -1 damage against it. It doesn't stack on Dreadnoughts, but you could apply it to really quite big stuff like a Repulsor or an Axtrius if you wanted to. Really quite good value for 1 CP, I think. The Tempered Helm is a command point farming one. You get the chance to farm command points on a 5+. Probably would add up to more CP over the course of the game if you can afford the buy-in. And otherwise they've got a couple of nice durability upgrades in the Gorgon's Chain and the Aegis Ferrum, and also the Axe of Medusa for a fighty relic if you need one, Strength 7, AP -3 and Damage 3 for a Power Axe. There's a couple of really quite standout Warlord traits as well. I will be quite tempted to pick up Rights of War from the core codex. Having an aura of objective secured is pretty nice, maybe backed up by some extra tough Thunderhammer Terminators that we'll get onto. Perhaps my other 2 favourite ones though are Student of History, which is really quite a nice melee one. After your character has fought, it gets to consolidate 6 inches in any direction, including straight out of combat if you want to, allowing a character to do quite a gamey thing like run up to the enemy, hit them hard in combat, and then just consolidate straight back out, no questions asked. It's a fairly enormous bonus to have on a combat character. The other one I like a lot is Target Protocols. This one allows you to give a buff to a nearby Iron Hands unit of any flavour. They get to reroll 1 hit, 1 roll, 1 wound roll, and 1 damage roll when they make their shooting attack. And perhaps the best thing about this one is that it's not core locked. You could give it to something like a unit of Devastator Centurions, or perhaps a Repulsor Executioner for the big main gun. Really quite nice for a buffing Warlord. I could imagine something like a Tech Marine or a Lieutenant having that around. Finally, for normal character things, we've also got the Librarian as well, and I think that Librarians are a standout good choice for the Iron Hands. My favourite 3 powers for them are Steel Armour, Reforge, and Blessing of the Machine God. Steel Armour I think is probably the best one. It just gives you a nice simple, uncomplicated +1 to your saving throw for a unit, pretty much guarantees to be good news for durability. This one's really nice on just about anything tanky, particularly if it had a 2+ save, say a Storm Shield unit or a big tank like an Astrius. But I feel like in particular it's going to be really nice on Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators now they got so crazily cheap and efficient with the points updates. The Terminators already have a 2+ save with a +1 buff to it, so effectively a 1+ save. This one will get them down to a theoretical 0+ save, so they're still saving anything that's -2 AP on a 2+, and that'll go up to an AP3 attack if they manage to get light cover as well. Pretty crazy toughness there. I could easily imagine a big solid block of those advancing towards the midfield objectives being very efficient. Otherwise, they've got a couple of good vehicle buffing ones, one called Reforge for healing D3 wounds on a vehicle, and one called Blessing of the Machine Gods to give you a +1 to hit for a vehicle, though it needs to be cast on a big 8+ if you're going to affect a Titanic unit. Would be quite nice to have them around, maybe buffing a Terminator battle line or something, and then throw one of those buffs towards your nearby battle tanks or dreadnoughts. Otherwise, talking of both characters and dreadnoughts, the Iron Hands have one. You have the potential to make basically an untouchable gun turret protected by Lookout Sir. The way that you do this is with a stratagem called March of the Ancients, a 1 command point upgrade that you'd ideally want to apply to a dreadnought with less than 10 wounds, either a Contemptor Dreadnought or potentially a Venerable Dreadnought if you didn't want to pay the extra CP tax. This makes the Dreadnought into a character, and it means that you can't be shot directly as you'd be protected by Lookout Sir, provided you've got something tough in the way. Often the best choice for the strategy is a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought. Something like the Twin Volkite loadout plus a Cyclone missile launcher is quite a common choice, and that'd be extra nice in the all-game Devastator Doctrine. AP-1 on the Volkite is absolutely brutal, particularly now Armour of Contempt has gone away. That is an extra CP and does put a bit of pressure on pre-game spend and things, but if you want to go absolutely all in on the strategy, you could also spend an extra command point to give it a Warlord trait. The one that's often taken that I've seen is typically Merciless Logic. This one's another one that maybe isn't so great on standard characters, but is really nice on a big pile of guns like a Dreadnought. It means that 6s to hit generate an extra attack that you can make with the same weapon, and when you can have this guy potentially hitting on a 2+ with a Tech Marine or that Librarian spell, that'll mean an extra attack hitting on a 2 and re-rolling 1s. That'll mean 16 Volkite shots and a couple of missile shots, all at a pip of extra AP, re-rolling the 1s, hitting on 2s hopefully from a nearby buff, and then exploding 6s to hit, meaning that you should be getting more hits than you have shots, and all at improved AP as well. You could even have a nearby lieutenant, or use the Wisdom of the Ancient stratagem if you are feeling even more generous. It is very command point intensive, but you do have a gun turret that's just going to tear holes in just about anything in the game, and a gun turret that the enemy can't do anything about until they actually get up close and engage it directly. Otherwise, besides March of the Ancients, the stratagem section throughout does remain fairly strong. Mercier's weakness is quite a nice one for 1 CP, 6s to wound counters 2 wounds on the target, particularly nice if you were wounding on 4s or 5s before, maybe Grav Cannons or those Volkites to add extra insult to injury. It's a strong buff for 1 CP, but it does mean that you need to focus all your attacks on 1 unit. For 2 CP there's Souls of Iron, a 4+ chance to deny psychic power, which could be quite nice against some armies, say trying to do psychic secondaries. 1 command point for Reject the Flesh is a very good value one as well. That one gives you a pretty significant infantry feel no pain type save, either a 5+ if you don't have the standard chapter tactic, or a 4+ if you do. For a reactive durability boost, that one is actually very good. Imagine a big unit of Vanguard veterans or Terminators suddenly manifesting a very good feel no pain. In combat as well, if you need a small boost there, it's 1 command point for a +1 to hit in melee, and you also get +1 to wound if you happen to be playing Emperor's Children, though that's not going to be all that often. They're perhaps a few of my favourites. Besides that, there's things like using a Tech Marine to heal 2 vehicles rather than 1. The option for either 5+ or 4+ Overwatch if you've got the chapter tactic. That's an extra CP though, on top of spending the 1 to fire Overwatch in the first place. You can protect characters better with Cogitated Martyrdom for 1 CP, makes them very hard to remove but doesn't work on vehicles. And there's the one for extra AP on 6s to wound with heavy weapons across the whole army. That's 2 CP. I feel like in general it might be slightly overkill when you've got the extra AP from the Devastator Doctrine anyway, but against very high save targets it might well be alright. I'd say out of these ones in terms of raw value, Reject the Flesh and Mercier's Weakness both seem great, and Gorgon's Rage seems very usable in combat. Finally, let's talk units, and I thought we'd just quickly cover Ironfather Feirros, the only unique Iron Hands character. He's 130 points, and basically amounts to an upgraded version of a Primaris Tech Marine who's in Gravis armor. He's generally got a fairly tanky profile, 7 wounds with toughness 5 and a 2+ save. Not too bad in combat with 5 attacks with a strength 7 damage 2 power axe, and has a few shots with his boosted Forge Bolter. He's also got a 5+ feel no pain, which really helps keep him safe. I think the main reasons that you want to bring him though are his Signum Array, which allows a friendly Iron Hands unit within 3 inches to get +1 to hit at range. It's a bit more flexible than the regular Tech Marines one, as it doesn't just have to target vehicles. You could make a big infantry unit better at hitting if you wanted to. Could work on some fairly unusual stuff as well, like say Devastator Centurions if you wanted that. The potential for quite a big hit boost to a powerful unit there. Otherwise, he heals 3 wounds to a vehicle per turn, which is really quite good. He's a Master of the Forge. And then he has a Rites of Tempering special rule, which gives a 5+ invul save to nearby infantry within 6 inches. Again, very useful when Armour of Contempt has gone away. I think it'd be handy enough on any threatening Space Marines with a 3+ save, whether they're things like Devastators, Stern Guard, Aggressors, or whatever. I feel like if he can get multiple bits of his buffs going, then he isn't too bad for 130 points. I think you just want to hang out somewhere towards the middle of your force and try and use as many of the different rules as you can. It's a bit of a mixed unit, as he both wants to be sort of fighting with the enemy and also healing your vehicles big, buffing a shooting unit and protecting infantry all at the same time. It does mean that if you took him you would have to give up going Iron Hand successors or anything though, so I guess that's a bit of a trade-off there. Looking at the rest of the Space Marine Codex though, I would stand by Iron Hands being perhaps the standout chapter for about half the units within Codex Space Marines. Basically anything that's a vehicle or carries heavy weapons around is absolutely great with them, and a few things outside of those categories are as well. In the HQ slots, I feel like Librarians and Tech Marines are perhaps going to be the favoured choices. The Sidesteel Armour spell is great, and Tech Marines are pretty awesome for supporting all the armoured vehicles. As mentioned, I feel like Thunderhammer Terminators with Sidesteel Armour are a combo that's going to be seeing table time. A massively durable unit in an army that's become a lot more of a glass cannon type army. Loads of units with enormous damage but aren't so hard to kill with Armour of Contempt gone. Then I feel like Iron Hands could go very heavy on the Strategic Reserve and drop pods if they wanted to. Have a whole load of drop threats with say Devastators with Grav Cannons, Las Cannons or Multi-Melters. A couple of Multi-Melters and Stern Guard squads seem really efficient. Eradicators with heavy melter rifles, either starting on the board or coming in from Strategic Reserve, and maybe having a few suppressors bouncing around in the backfield. Their guns are really quite efficient and general purpose, and can both make the use of their good movement and good range damage, when Iron Hands doesn't force them to choose between both. Non-core choices like Devastator Centurions or Firestrike servo turrets could also be worth a look. For vehicles, as mentioned, the Character Dreadnought is a very efficient choice. It does take a lot of CP though. Looks like it'd be a little nightmare to have sat in the middle of your army just blasting out loads of damage. I think the Gladiator tanks have gone down to the extent where they're really quite interesting. I think that the Reaper in particular looks great for the Iron Hands with the all-game Devastator Doctrine. A whole load of shots, all at AP -2. Land Speeders and Attack Bikes seem fine as well. Extra damage on both of them, particularly the Land Speeder Tornado. And I feel like while the Redemptor Dreadnoughts maybe didn't get the massive amount of buffs that a lot of units got in the update, they're still one of the most efficient Space Marine choices. Dreadnought Castles I think could easily still be a thing. Finally, if you do want really big vehicles, I think that the Primaris Super Heavy Astrius is worth a shout as well. Iron Hands lists were using that every so often already. It's really big and tough and has generalist damage output. This thing will absolutely love being in Devastator Doctrine all game long, getting the reroll ones, and even being able to make use of chapter tactics now that you can take it within the same detachment as the rest of the force. Lastly, they're certainly not precluded from taking any generic strong picks that don't necessarily synergize with them as well as some. Plasma and Scepters are going to be scary whatever army they're in, and Vanguard veterans are fast moving, hard hitting and have storm shields, all of which are good things, and Iron Hands do have some things to help them like that +1 to hit stratagem or the 5+ feel no pain save. So overall, Iron Hands can just bring some ridiculously spectacular damage output to the table, and it seems like there's quite a lot of ways that you could go with list building. I feel like there's going to be a hefty amount of Devastators and other infantry with heavy weapons making up their lists though. Let me know what you make of the changes and which units you think are going to be best for them down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the overview, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be keeping the regular 40k tactics videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines going forward. If you'd like another recent Space Marine video to watch, I'll link to my overview of the points changes in Arcs of Omen down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is how I can afford to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. As well as automatically entering you for that monthly prize draw, there's a few other benefits. You get to see certain videos early on the channel, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and there's a few other things like your name in the credits and custom videos and things. Feel free to check it out if you're interested, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.